The secret in the shadows. The courtroom hummed with quiet anticipation. At the center of it all sat Marcus, a 12-year-old boy with a presence far greater than his small stature suggested. The boy had grown accustomed to watching adults debate his future, yet today felt different. His heart beat erratically as he glanced at the rows of observers lining the courtroom. Lawyers whispered in hushed tones, reporters scribbled frantically, and strangers cast curious looks his way. Each moment felt heavier than the last. Judge Harrison, a man with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for unwavering fairness, adjusted his glasses and peered down at Marcus. "Marcus, do you understand why we're here today?" His deep voice echoed in the grand room. Marcus nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. The judge's gaze softened. "Good. Today is about determining what's best for your future. Do you have anything you'd like to say before we proceed?" Marcus hesitated, his fingers gripping the edges of the wooden chair. He glanced at his foster parents, the Walkers, sitting beside him. They were kind people, the sort who never raised their voices or made him feel like a burden. Mrs. Walker gave him a reassuring smile, and Mr. Walker placed a hand on his shoulder. But something had been weighing on Marcus, a truth he had never shared. He had promised himself he wouldn't bring it up, not today of all days. But now, staring at the judge and the sea of expectant faces, he knew he couldn't hold it in any longer. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice trembling. I have something I need to tell you." The judge leaned forward, intrigued. "Go ahead, Marcus. This is your moment." Marcus swallowed hard. His small voice cut through the courtroom. "I have a sister." A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by murmurs of disbelief. Mrs. Walker froze, her hand hovering in midair, while Mr. Walker's brows knit together in surprise. Even Judge Harrison appeared momentarily taken aback. "A sister," the judge repeated, his tone cautious. "Marcus, this is the first time we're hearing about this. Can you tell us more?" Marcus nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Her name is Mia. She's my twin. We got separated when we were little. I haven't seen her since." The room erupted into chaos. Lawyers whispered furiously to their clients, and reporters hastily jotted down notes. The bailiff called for order, his voice booming above the commotion. Judge Harrison raised his gavel, but hesitated. Instead of striking it, he turned to his clerk. "Clear the courtroom. Now." The bailiff moved swiftly, ushering out journalists, non-essential personnel, and curious onlookers. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, and the clerk turned the lock with a decisive click. The silence that followed was deafening. "Marcus," the judge said gently, his voice steady and reassuring. "You're safe here. Tell me everything." Tears streamed down Marcus's face as he recounted his story. "We were taken from our mom when we were 5. They said she couldn't take care of us. Maya and I stayed together for a while, but then they split us up. I tried asking about her, but no one would tell me where she went." Mrs. Walker placed a trembling hand over her heart. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered, "why didn't you tell us?" Marcus sniffled, his voice barely audible. "I was scared. Scared they'd move me again, or that they'd say she's gone forever." The judge leaned back in his chair, his face thoughtful. "This changes everything. Marcus, I promise we will look into this immediately. Family is important, and if your sister is out there, we will find her." That evening, back at the Walkers' cozy home, Marcus sat curled up on the couch, a mug of hot chocolate warming his hands. The Walkers sat beside him, their expressions a mix of concern and determination. "Why didn't you tell us sooner, sweetheart?" Mrs. Walker asked softly, tucking a blanket around Marcus. "I didn't want to ruin anything," Marcus admitted. "You're the first people who've made me feel safe. I didn't want to mess that up." Mr. Walker knelt beside him, looking him square in the eye. "You could never ruin anything, Marcus. Family is what matters most, and Milia is part of your family. That makes her part of ours too." We'll do whatever it takes to find her." As they spoke, the weight of the day began to lift from Marcus's shoulders. He wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. The following morning, the Walkers wasted no time. Mr. Walker was on the phone with their lawyer, requesting access to Marcus's case files. Mrs. Walker reached out to every adoption agency they could find, asking questions and leaving messages. By midday, they had learned a shocking detail. Mia was still in the foster care system, placed with a family in a nearby state. The news sent a wave of relief through the Walkers and Marcus, but it was short-lived. "There's a complication," Mrs. Walker said, reading aloud from an email. "Another family has already started the adoption process for Mia." Marcus's heart sank. What does that mean? Are they going to take her away? Mr. Walker placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not if we can help it." That evening, they sat around the kitchen table, strategizing. The Walkers decided to contact a private investigator, someone who could dig deeper into Mia's case. Within hours, they were on a video call with Mr. Daniels, a seasoned PI with a reputation for reuniting families. "Finding Mia won't be the hard part," Mr. Daniels said confidently. "The hard part will be proving that she belongs with Marcus. And with you." "Whatever it takes," Mrs. Walker replied firmly. "We'll do it." As the call ended, Marcus felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Mia. Whatever it took, he would find his sister. He would bring her home. And in his heart, he knew this was only the beginning of their journey. A fragmented past. The next morning dawned quietly in the Walkers' household, but inside, an emotional storm brewed. Marcus barely touched his breakfast, the cereal in his bowl turning soggy as he stared out the window. His thoughts were a whirlwind, images of Mia flashing in his mind like a flickering film reel. What did she look like now? Was she happy? Was she safe? Across the table, Mrs. Walker watched him with a mother's intuition. "Marcus, sweetheart, I know this is hard, but we'll get through it together. You're not alone anymore." Her words were warm, but Marcus felt the knot of worry tighten in his chest. "What if we're too late?" He whispered, barely audible. "What if she doesn't even remember me?" Mrs. Walker reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. "Family ties don't break that easily, Marcus. You've carried her in your heart all these years. I'm sure she's done the same for you." In the living room, Mr. Walker paced back and forth, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. "Yes, Mr. Daniels. That's correct. She's in the Matthews household. They're listed as her current guardians." On the other end of the call, the private investigator's tone was grim. "The Matthews? That's concerning. Their name came up in a few prior investigations, allegations of neglect and mistreatment. Nothing was ever proven. But where there's smoke, there's often fire." Mr. Walker's jaw tightened. "What do we need to do?" "I'm already working on gaining access to their records," Daniels replied. "But we have to tread carefully. If the family catches wind of this before we're ready, they might try to move Mia or even cover their tracks." "Do whatever you have to," Mr. Walker said firmly. "We won't let her slip through the cracks again." Later that afternoon, Marcus found himself sitting in the small study the Walkers had converted into his reading space. Bookshelves lined the walls, and the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminated a photo of the three of them from a recent trip to the park. But Marcus's eyes weren't on the books or the photo. They were on a small, weathered keepsake box in his lap. The box was one of the few items he had been allowed to keep through years of bouncing between foster homes. His fingers trembled as he opened it, revealing a collection of faded memories. A crumpled photo of him and Mia as toddlers, a pink ribbon she had once tied in his hair to make him laugh, and a paper flower she had folded for him during a stormy night at one of their early placements. He picked up the photo, running his fingers over Mia's smiling face. Even then, she had been the brave one, the one who had whispered, "It's going to be okay," when he was too scared to sleep. She had been his anchor, his light in the darkness. and then she was gone. Marcus didn't realize Mrs. Walker had entered the room until she knelt beside him, her gentle hand on his shoulder. "Is that her?" she asked softly, her gaze falling on the photo. Marcus nodded, his throat tight. "She used to call me her shadow, said no matter where she went, I was always right behind her." Mrs. Walker smiled faintly, her heart breaking for the boy she had come to love as her own. "And now it's your turn to be her shadow, Marcus. We're going to bring her back. You have my word." As night fell, Mr. Daniels called again with an update. His voice carried a note of urgency that immediately set the Walkers on edge. "I've been watching the Matthews household," Daniels began. "Mia seems withdrawn. She doesn't interact much with the other kids, and there are signs that she might not be treated well." "What kind of signs?" Mrs. Walker pressed, her voice trembling. "Yesterday, she was made to rake the yard in sweltering heat while the others stayed inside," Daniel said. "She was out there for hours without a break. It's clear they're singling her out." Mrs. Walker covered her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. "That poor girl." Daniels's tone hardened. "I also learned they're planning to move her soon. They mentioned something about another placement." "Another placement?" Mr. Walker echoed, his voice rising. "They can't keep bouncing her around like this. She needs stability." "That's why I'm escalating things," Daniel said. "I've set up a meeting with the judge overseeing her case. We'll need to prove that Marcus's connection to Mia is more than just biological. If we can demonstrate that separating them is causing emotional harm, we might be able to block the adoption proceedings with the other family." "How soon can we meet with the judge?" Mr. Walker asked, his determination unshaken. "Tomorrow morning," Daniels replied. "I'll bring everything I've gathered so far. Be ready." The next day, Marcus dressed in his best clothes, the same ones he had worn to his own adoption hearing. The Walkers told him he didn't need to come, but he insisted. This wasn't just their fight, it was his too. The courthouse felt larger and colder than Marcus remembered. As they walked through its echoing halls, he gripped Mr. Walker's hand tightly, drawing strength from the man's steady presence. Inside the judge's chambers, Daniels presented his findings, a file thick with evidence of neglect, witness statements from neighbors, and even photos of Mia working in the yard under the harsh sun. Judge Harrison, the same man who had presided over Marcus's case, listened intently, his brow furrowed in concern. "This is deeply troubling," the judge said, flipping through the file. "If the Matthews household is unfit, I'll need to order an emergency evaluation." Daniels leaned forward. "With all due respect, Your Honor, we don't have time for evaluations. The Matthews are planning to move Mia by the end of the week. If we wait, she could disappear into another state system, and finding her again will be nearly impossible." The judge tapped his pen against his desk, deep in thought. "What do you propose?" Daniels hesitated, glancing at the Walkers and Marcus before speaking. "We need an emergency court order to remove Mia from the Matthews custody immediately. She should be placed in temporary care with the Walkers while the case is reviewed." Marcus's heart soared at the possibility but sank just as quickly when the judge sighed. "This isn't a decision I can make lightly," the judge said. "But considering the circumstances, I'll authorize the order. However, the Walkers must understand that this is only temporary until we can conduct a full investigation." Mrs. Walker nodded fervently. "We understand, Your Honor. We'll do whatever it takes." That evening, back at the Walkers' home, Marcus could hardly contain his excitement. They were finally going to bring Mia home, or at least closer to home. For the first time in years, hope felt real, tangible. But in the back of his mind, a lingering doubt whispered, what if Mia didn't want to come? What if the years apart had changed her so much that she didn't even recognize him anymore? As he lay awake in bed that night, clutching the old photo of the two of them, Marcus made a silent vow. No matter what it took, he would prove to Mia that she wasn't alone, that her shadow had never truly left her. The journey to Mia. The next morning, the air in the Walker household buzzed with nervous energy. Marcus could feel it as he sat at the breakfast table, absent-mindedly stirring his cereal. Mr. Walker stood near the window, phone in hand, speaking in a hushed tone to Mr. Daniels, while Mrs. Walker busied herself in the kitchen, clinking dishes louder than usual. "We need to move quickly," Mr. Walker said, hanging up the phone. He turned to his wife and Marcus, his face a mixture of determination and concern. "The court order is finalized, but the Matthews haven't been informed yet. Daniels is heading there now to oversee the transfer." "Do we get to go?" Marcus asked, hope flickering in his eyes. Mrs. Walker knelt beside him, brushing a hand over his curls. "Not yet, sweetheart. This is going to be a delicate process. We don't want to overwhelm Mia. Mr. Daniels will bring her here as soon as everything is settled." Marcus nodded slowly, but his heart sank. He wanted to be there, to see Mia's face the moment she realized she wasn't alone anymore. He wanted her to know that her brother was still fighting for her. Meanwhile, Mr. Daniels arrived at the Matthews' modest house, its peeling paint and overgrown lawn a stark contrast to the sunny suburban neighborhood surrounding it. He parked his car a few houses down and adjusted the badge clipped to his lapel. It marked him as a social services inspector, a guise he had carefully maintained during his investigation. He approached the house, his sharp eyes scanning for any signs of movement. The curtains in the front window twitched slightly, and the door opened before he could knock. Mrs. Matthews, a stout woman with a scowl permanently etched on her face, stood in the doorway. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone dripping with irritation. "Good morning," Mr. Daniels said smoothly, flashing his badge. "I'm here for a routine welfare check. May I come in?" Mrs. Matthews hesitated, her eyes narrowing. "We weren't informed about any inspection. These visits are often unannounced to ensure an accurate assessment," Daniels replied. "It won't take long." Reluctantly, Mrs. Matthews stepped aside, her glare lingering as Daniels entered the dimly lit house. The interior was cluttered and unkempt, the air heavy with a mix of stale food and cleaning chemicals. "Where are the children?" Daniels asked, his voice calm but firm. "They're in the back," Mrs. Matthews replied tersely. "They're fine." "I'd like to see them," Daniels said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mrs. Matthews led him down a narrow hallway to a small bedroom shared by 3 children. 2 of them, a boy and a girl, sat on the floor playing with mismatched toys. But Daniels's eyes immediately sought out Mia. She was sitting on the edge of a bunk bed, her posture rigid and her eyes downcast. Her dark curls framed a face that looked far too tired for a child her age. She didn't look up as Daniels entered, but her hands fidgeted with the hem of her oversized sweater, a silent signal of her unease. "Hello, Mia," Daniels said gently, crouching to her level. "My name is Mr. Daniels. I'm here to talk to you." Her eyes flicked to him briefly, but she said nothing. "She's shy," Mrs. Matthews interjected. "Doesn't talk much." Daniels ignored her, focusing entirely on Mia. "It's okay, Mia. You're not in trouble. I'm just here to make sure you're doing all right. Can you tell me how you're feeling?" Mia's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She glanced nervously at Mrs. Matthews, who stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Mrs. Matthews," Daniels said without turning around, "I need to speak with Mia privately." Mrs. Matthews bristled. "That's not necessary. She doesn't have anything to say." "It's standard protocol," Daniels said firmly. "Please step outside." For a moment, it seemed like Mrs. Matthews might refuse, but after a tense pause, she huffed and left the room, slamming the door behind her. Daniels waited a moment, listening to her retreating footsteps before speaking again. "Mia, it's just you and me now. You can tell me anything, and I promise I'll listen." Mia's hand stilled, and her eyes finally met his. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel smiled gently. "Because someone cares about you very much. Your brother, Marcus, has been trying to find you for years." At the mention of Marcus's name, Mia's eyes widened. "Marcus?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Yes, Daniel said, his heart breaking at the mixture of hope and disbelief in her expression. He's with a wonderful family now. The Walkers. They've been fighting to bring you home. Tears welled in Mia's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. He remembers me, she asked, her voice cracking. Of course he does, Daniel said. He never stopped thinking about you. By the time Daniels left the Matthews house with Mia by his side, she was clutching her small backpack and a single stuffed animal. Mrs. Matthews had protested, of course, but the court order left her no choice. Mia's face was a mask of caution as she climbed into Daniels's car, her body tense and her eyes darting around nervously. It's going to be okay, Daniel said as he started the car. You're going to a place where people care about you. Mia didn't respond, but as the car pulled away from the Matthews house, some of the tension in her shoulders seemed to ease. She stared out the window, her fingers gripping the straps of her backpack. When they arrived at the Walkers' house, Mia hesitated at the bottom of the driveway. The house was warm and inviting, with flower boxes lining the windows and a porch swing swaying gently in the breeze. It was so different from anything she had ever known that it almost felt unreal. Inside, Marcus stood by the living room window, his heart racing as he watched the car pull in. When he saw Mia step out, he let out a shaky breath. She was taller now, her features sharper, but there was no mistaking her. It was Mia. The door opened and Daniel stepped in first, gesturing for Mia to follow. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Marcus, Daniel said with a smile. There's someone here to see you. Marcus didn't wait. He ran to Mia, stopping just short of wrapping her in a hug. Mia, he said, his voice breaking. It's me. It's Marcus. Mia stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to reconcile the boy in front of her with the brother she remembered. Then, slowly, a smile broke through her cautious expression. Marcus, she whispered, her voice filled with both disbelief and relief. This time, when Marcus stepped forward, she didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around him, holding on as if letting go would mean losing him again. Tears streamed down both their faces, but neither of them cared. The Walkers stood nearby, tears in their own eyes as they watched the reunion. Mrs. Walker placed a hand over her heart, while Mr. Walker wrapped an arm around her shoulders. You're home now, Marcus whispered into Mia's ear. I promise you're never going to be alone again. For the first time in years, Mia believed him. Rebuilding trust. The air in the Walker household was thick with emotion that night. Marcus and Mia sat side by side on the couch, their knees barely touching, as though afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile reality they had just stepped into. Mia clutched her stuffed bear tightly, her eyes darting around the room. Every creak of the floorboards and shadow on the wall seemed to make her flinch. Are you hungry, Mia? Mrs. Walker asked softly, kneeling in front of her. I can make you something to eat, whatever you'd like. Mia shook her head almost imperceptibly. No, thank you, she murmured, her voice so quiet it was nearly lost in the hum of the heating vent. It's okay, Marcus said, leaning closer to her. Mrs. Walker makes the best spaghetti. You'll like it here, I promise. Mia turned her wide eyes to him, searching his face as though trying to decode whether his words were real. You like it here? She asked hesitantly. Marcus nodded. Yeah, they're nice. They care about us. Mia's grip on the stuffed bear tightened. That's what they all say at first, she whispered, her voice trembling. Then it changes. Mrs. Walker's heart broke at the statement. She had read the reports Daniels had provided. Mia's years in the foster care system had been riddled with neglect, empty promises, and a kind of treatment no child should ever endure. She couldn't erase those experiences, but she vowed to show Mia something different, something real. That evening, after Mia had reluctantly eaten a few bites of dinner and changed into some of the new pajamas Mrs. Walker had bought for her, Marcus led her to his room. He had insisted on giving her his bed for the night, claiming he could sleep on the floor. Mia hesitated at the doorway, her small frame silhouetted by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. "Come on," Marcus said, patting the bed. "It's comfy, I promise." Mia stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning every corner of the room. When she saw the keepsake box on the nightstand, her breath hitched. "You kept it," she whispered, reaching out to touch it. Marcus nodded, his voice soft. "It's all I had left of you." Mia opened the box, her fingers trembling as she pulled out the crumpled photo of them as toddlers. Her lips quivered, and tears began to spill down her cheeks. "I thought I'd never see you again," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought you forgot about me." "Never," Marcus said firmly, moving to sit beside her. "I looked for you every chance I got. I told everyone about you. It just took a while to find someone who listened." Mia wiped her eyes with her sleeve, her expression a mixture of sadness and relief. "I missed you," she whispered. "I missed you too," Marcus said, wrapping an arm around her. For the first time in years, Mia allowed herself to lean into him, her small body trembling with the weight of her emotions. The next few days were a delicate dance of patience and adjustment. Mia was wary of everything: the walkers, the unfamiliar house, even Marcus at times. She spoke little and often retreated to the guest room, where she would sit by the window and stare out at the world she barely trusted. But the walkers never pushed. They let Mia set the pace, offering her kindness and space in equal measure. Mrs. Walker left small notes on her bedside table, little messages of encouragement like, "We're so happy you're here, and you are loved." Mr. Walker made sure to include her in family activities, even if she chose to sit on the sidelines. Slowly but surely, the walls around Mia began to crack. One afternoon, Marcus found Mia sitting in the backyard, her knees drawn to her chest. She was staring at a patch of wildflowers growing near the fence, her expression distant. "Hey," he said, sitting down beside her. "What are you doing?" "Just thinking," Mia replied, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "About what?" She hesitated before answering. "About what's real." Marcus tilted his head, confused. "What do you mean?" Mia turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "Every time I thought something was safe, it wasn't. Every time I thought someone cared, they didn't. How do I know this is real? That it won't change?" Marcus reached out and took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Because I'm here," he said simply. "And I'm not going anywhere. Ever." Mia's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "You promise?" Marcus nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I promise." That evening, Mrs. Walker found Mia sitting at the piano in the living room, her small fingers hovering over the keys. She hadn't touched it since she arrived, though she often lingered near it as if drawn to its presence. "Do you play?" Mrs. Walker asked, sitting down on the bench beside her. Mia shook her head. "Not really. But Marcus used to hum a tune when we were little. I think he made it up." "Do you remember it?" Mrs. Walker asked gently. Mia nodded. "A little." "Why don't you try playing it?" Mrs. Walker suggested. "I can help if you'd like." Mia hesitated, then placed her fingers on the keys. The melody came slowly, haltingly at first, but as Mrs. Walker guided her, the notes began to flow more smoothly. It was a simple tune, but it carried an unmistakable weight, an echo of the bond she shared with Marcus, a connection that had endured despite years of separation. When Marcus walked into the room and heard the melody, he froze. "That's our song," he said, his voice filled with wonder. Mia turned to him, a small tentative smile breaking through her usual guarded expression. "I remembered it," she said. Marcus grinned, walking over to sit beside her. "Let's finish it together." The three of them sat at the piano that night, adding harmonies and flourishes to the tune until it became something new, something theirs. For the first time since arriving, Mia laughed, a sound so light and pure it brought tears to Mrs. Walker's eyes. By the end of the week, Mia was beginning to settle in. She still had moments of hesitation, times when she would retreat into herself or flinch at sudden noises, but the Walkers and Marcus were patient. They knew healing would take time. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Mia looked up from her plate and spoke unprompted. I like it here," she said softly. Mrs. Walker's eyes widened in surprise and joy. "We're so glad to hear that, Mia. You're part of our family now." Mia looked at Marcus, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Family," she repeated, the word unfamiliar but comforting on her tongue. It wasn't just a word to her anymore. It was a promise of safety, of belonging, and of love. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Mia began to believe in it. The shadows of the past. Mia had been living with the Walkers for 2 weeks when the nightmares started. The first one jolted her awake in the middle of the night, her small frame trembling and her breath coming in rapid gasps. The faint light from the moon filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the room. She clutched the blanket tightly, her heart pounding as fragments of the dream swirled in her mind. The harsh voice of Mrs. Matthews, the suffocating loneliness of her old room, and the crushing fear that no one would come for her. Maya slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent against the cool wooden floor. She tiptoed down the hallway, her instinct to hide still deeply ingrained. She stopped outside Marcus's room, hesitating for a moment before quietly pushing the door open. Marcus was sprawled out on his bed, one arm dangling off the side. His room was a mess, books and toys scattered across the floor, but it felt safe, familiar. Maya stood there for a moment, unsure if she should wake him. But as another wave of fear washed over her, she stepped closer and gently shook his shoulder. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you awake?" Marcus groaned, turning over to blink at her sleepily. When he saw the fear in her eyes, he sat up immediately. "Mia, what's wrong?" "I had a bad dream," she admitted, her voice barely audible. I didn't want to be alone." Without hesitation, Marcus scooted over and patted the space beside him. "Come here." Mia climbed into the bed, curling up under the blanket as Marcus pulled it over both of them. "What was it about?" he asked gently. She hesitated, staring at the ceiling. "It was about her, Mrs. Matthews. I keep thinking she's going to come back and take me away." Marcus's jaw tightened. "She's not going to take you. You're safe here." Mia nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," Marcus said firmly. "Mrs. Walker and Mr. Walker won't let anything happen to you. And I won't either." For the first time since the nightmare, Mia felt a small sense of relief. She snuggled closer to Marcus, her eyes growing heavy as his steady breathing calmed her. "Thanks, Marcus," she murmured before drifting back to sleep. The next morning, Mrs. Walker noticed the dark circles under Mia's eyes. "Did you sleep okay, sweetheart?" she asked as Mia poked at her scrambled eggs. Mia hesitated, then nodded. It was just a hard night. Mrs. Walker exchanged a glance with Mr. Walker, her concern evident. "If you ever want to talk about anything, we're here for you," she said softly. Mia nodded again, but didn't respond. She wasn't sure how to explain the gnawing fear that clung to her even in the daylight. That afternoon, while Mrs. Walker was folding laundry and Marcus was in the backyard practicing soccer drills, Mia sat in the guest room staring at the photo of her and Marcus as toddlers. Her fingers traced the edges of the worn picture, her mind replaying memories of their early days together. The nights they spent whispering under the covers, the silly songs Marcus used to make up, the way he always tried to make her laugh, even when things were scary. She wanted to believe things could be like that again, but a voice in her head kept whispering that it was too good to last. As she sat there, a knock on the door startled her. She quickly tucked the photo into her pocket and looked up to see Mr. Walker standing in the doorway. "Hey, Mia," he said with a warm smile. "Can I show you something?" Mia hesitated but eventually nodded, following him downstairs. He led her to the living room, where a cardboard box sat on the coffee table. "I found this in the attic," he said, opening the box to reveal a collection of old board games. "I thought maybe you and Marcus would like to play." Mia's eyes lit up as she spotted a familiar game from her childhood. "Candyland," she said softly, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "You like that one?" Mr. Walker asked. Mia nodded. "We used to play it in one of my foster homes. Marcus always let me win." Mr. Walker chuckled. "Well, let's see if you still remember how to play." He called Marcus in from the backyard, and the three of them sat on the floor, the colorful game board spread out between them. At first, Mia was quiet, her movements hesitant as she drew cards and moved her game piece. But as the game went on, she began to relax, her laughter bubbling up every time Marcus landed on a licorice space and had to go backward. By the time the game ended, Mia's face was flushed with joy, and for a moment, the shadows of her past seemed to fade. That evening, as Mia helped Mrs. Walker clear the dinner table, she finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been weighing on her. "Mrs. Walker," she said, her voice hesitant. "Yes, sweetheart," Mrs. Walker replied, setting a stack of plates on the counter. "Do you think I'll ever have to go back?" Mia's voice cracked slightly, and she looked down at her feet, afraid of the answer. Mrs. Walker knelt down to Mia's level, taking her hands in her own. "Mia, I can't imagine how scary it must be to even think about that, but I want you to know that we're doing everything we can to make sure you stay here with us." Tears welled in Mia's eyes. What if it's not enough? What if they decide I belong somewhere else? Mrs. Walker pulled Mia into a gentle hug, her voice steady and reassuring. "You belong with us, Mia, and we'll fight for you, no matter what." Mia clung to Mrs. Walker, her tears soaking into the woman's sweater. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have a real home. That night, as Mia lay in bed, she thought about all the things she had experienced since coming to the Walkers' home. The safety, the kindness, the small moments of joy. They were things she hadn't dared to hope for before. She still wasn't sure if she could trust it completely, but she was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, she could. And as she drifted off to sleep, she whispered a silent prayer, a prayer for this fragile new life to hold, and for the shadows of her past to finally let her go. The fight for forever. The courtroom was colder than Mia had expected. The high ceilings and marble floors amplified every whisper, every shuffle of paper, every soft murmur from the rows of people seated behind her. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the stern-faced woman sitting across the aisle. Mrs. Matthews. Mia sat beside Marcus, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. On her other side were the Walkers, their presence a steadying force as they prepared for the hearing that would determine her future. Mr. Daniel stood at the front of the room, his briefcase packed with evidence and statements, ready to present their case. The stakes were high. Mrs. Matthews had filed a counterclaim, asserting that Mia's removal had been unjust and that she deserved another chance to care for her foster child. It was a desperate attempt to regain control, but one that carried enough weight to prolong the fight. Judge Harrison entered the room, his robes billowing as he took his seat. His sharp gaze swept across the courtroom, landing briefly on Mia. This hearing will determine whether Mia should remain with her current foster family or be returned to the care of Mrs. Matthews. Both sides will be given the opportunity to present their case. Mrs. Matthews' lawyer was the first to speak. He painted a picture of a misunderstood woman who had been unfairly judged. "My client has been a foster parent for years," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "While there may have been minor missteps, there is no concrete evidence of harm or neglect." Mia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Minor missteps. Was that what they called being sent outside for hours with no water? Was that what they called the cold, dismissive words that had made her feel like a burden every single day? Mrs. Walker leaned down and whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart. Just breathe." When it was Mr. Daniels's turn, he approached the bench with calm confidence. "Your Honor, I have evidence to the contrary," he began. "Witness statements from neighbors, reports of neglect filed by school staff, and, most importantly, Mia's own testimony." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You're saying the child is willing to testify?" "Yes, Your Honor," Daniels replied. He turned to Mia, his eyes softening. "Mia, would you like to share your story?" The courtroom fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Marcus squeezed her hand, and she drew strength from his unwavering support. Slowly, she stood, her legs trembling as she walked to the witness stand. "Take your time, Mia," the judge said gently as she was sworn in. Mia took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Mrs. Matthews," her voice faltered, but she pushed on. "She wasn't kind to me. She didn't care about me." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. "She made me do things the other kids didn't have to do. Like working in the yard all day, even when it was really hot. And if I asked for something, like water, she'd say I didn't deserve it." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, but the judge raised a hand for silence. "Go on, Mia." Mia's fingers gripped the edge of the stand. "She never told me I was good enough. She made me feel like I didn't matter." Her voice broke, but she straightened her shoulders, refusing to let the tears fall. "But I do matter, and I don't want to go back." Mrs. Matthews' lawyer stood, his face impassive. "Mia, you've been through a lot of homes, haven't you?" Mia nodded. "Is it possible," the lawyer continued, "that you misunderstood Mrs. Matthews' intentions? That perhaps she was trying to teach you responsibility?" Mia's jaw tightened. "No," she said firmly. "I know the difference." The lawyer opened his mouth to ask another question, but the judge cut him off. "That's enough," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "I've heard all I need to." The Walkers held their breath as the judge reviewed the evidence. Minutes felt like hours as he flipped through the file in front of him. Finally, he looked up, his gaze settling on Mia. "This decision isn't just about the law," he said. "It's about what's best for this child. And based on everything I've heard, it's clear to me that Mia's needs are being met and exceeded by the Walkers." Mrs. Walker let out a soft sob of relief, and Mr. Walker placed a hand over his heart, his expression one of pure gratitude. Marcus grinned and leaned over to whisper, "I told you we'd make it, Mia." The judge continued, "Effective immediately, Maya will remain in the care of the Walkers. Additionally, I am ordering a permanent placement hearing to finalize the adoption process." Mia's breath caught. Adoption. The word felt like a distant dream, something she had never dared to hope for. She turned to the Walkers, her eyes wide. "You mean I can stay?" Mrs. Walker pulled her into a hug, her tears spilling over. "Yes, sweetheart. You're part of our family now." The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. The Walkers threw a small celebration at home, complete with Mia's favorite foods, once they figured out what those were, and a cake that read, "Welcome Home." Marcus insisted on decorating the living room with balloons, and even though most of them ended up lopsided, Maya thought it was perfect. As she sat at the table surrounded by her new family, a warmth spread through her chest. She had spent so long feeling like a visitor in other people's lives, always bracing for the moment she would be sent away again. But now, for the first time, she felt something different, something she hadn't felt in years. She felt safe. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus found Mia sitting on the porch swing, a soft breeze tugging at her hair. He joined her, the two of them swaying gently in the fading light. "Do you think Mom would be happy?" Maya asked, her voice quiet. Marcus looked up at the sky, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I think she'd be really proud of you, of both of us." Mia nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "I think so too." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of their shared past fading into the background. They didn't need words to understand what they had been through. All that mattered was that they had made it out, together. Maya turned to Marcus, her smile widening. You were right, you know. About what? About this being real. About us being a family. Marcus grinned, nudging her playfully. Told you so. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Mia laughed, a light, unguarded sound that carried on the wind, echoing into the night. A forever bond. Weeks turned into months, and the shadows that had once clung to Maya's heart began to dissipate. The Walkers' home became her sanctuary, a place where laughter echoed through the halls and warmth seeped into every corner. She no longer hesitated before joining in family activities, and her guarded smiles gave way to carefree grins. But the journey to this new normal wasn't without its challenges. One rainy afternoon, Mia sat cross-legged on the living room floor, sorting through a box of photos Mrs. Walker had brought down from the attic. Marcus was sprawled on the couch, absently flipping through a book, while Mrs. Walker baked cookies in the kitchen. The scent of vanilla and chocolate wafted through the air, making the house feel cozier than ever. Mia picked up a photo of a younger Marcus holding a soccer ball, his face lit up with a toothy grin. You look ridiculous, she teased, holding it up for him to see. Marcus glanced at the photo and smirked. That's called charisma. You should try it sometime. Mia rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a laugh. Charisma? Sure. You look like you just got told Santa's not real. I was 8. Cut me some slack, Marcus protested, throwing a pillow at her. Mrs. Walker poked her head into the room, a smile tugging at her lips. No pillow fights around the photo box, you two. Those pictures are irreplaceable. Yes, ma'am, Marcus said, saluting dramatically. As Mia turned back to the box, her hand brushed against something buried at the bottom. She pulled it out, a small, slightly worn photo album bound in red leather. The edges were frayed, and the cover bore the initials M and M in faded gold letters. What's this? Maya asked, holding it up. Mrs. Walker walked over, wiping her hands on a towel. When she saw the album, her expression softened. That must have been packed with your things when you first arrived. I didn't realize it was in there. Mia opened the album cautiously. Inside were photos she hadn't seen in years, snapshots of her and Marcus as toddlers, their mother smiling down at them, their small family frozen in moments of happiness. There were pictures of birthday parties with homemade cakes, trips to the park, and even a blurry photo of Mia trying to climb onto Marcus's tricycle. Tears pricked at Mia's eyes as she flipped through the pages. I didn't think I'd ever see these again, she whispered. Marcus slid off the couch to sit beside her. He leaned over her shoulder, his eyes scanning the familiar images. I forgot about that tricycle, he said with a chuckle. You were determined to steal it from me. You wouldn't let me ride it. Maya shot back, but her tone was light, nostalgic. Mrs. Walker placed a comforting hand on Mia's shoulder. Your mother looks like she was a wonderful person, she said softly. You must miss her a lot. Mia nodded, her voice thick with emotion. I do, but I'm glad we have these. It's like a piece of her is still here. The next morning, Marcus and Mia woke up to an unusual buzz of excitement in the house. Mr. Walker was up early, pacing the kitchen while talking on the phone, and Mrs. Walker seemed to be fussing over every detail of their breakfast. What's going on? Marcus asked, rubbing his eyes as he shuffled into the kitchen. Mrs. Walker smiled brightly. Today's a big day, sweetheart. We're finalizing the adoption. Maya froze mid-step, her heart skipping a beat. Finalizing, she echoed. Mr. Walker hung up the phone and turned to them, his expression brimming with joy. That's right. Today, we're going to the courthouse, and when it's done, you'll officially be part of our family. Mia's hands trembled as she clutched the back of a chair. The word official carried a weight she wasn't sure she could describe. It meant permanence, stability, a promise that wouldn't be broken. You okay? Marcus asked, nudging her gently. Mia nodded, a small smile breaking through her uncertainty. Yeah, I didn't think this would ever happen. It's happening, Marcus said firmly. "And it's going to be awesome." The courthouse felt different this time. Instead of the cold, intimidating space Mia had first encountered, it now felt like the setting of a celebration. The Walkers had even invited a few close friends to join them, and they filled the gallery with smiles and soft whispers of encouragement. Mia sat beside Marcus at the table, her fingers intertwined with his. Judge Harrison, the same judge who had listened to her story months ago, presided over the hearing. His warm gaze landed on Mia as he spoke. "Mia, I remember the courage it took for you to sit in this courtroom and tell us your story," he said. "Today, we're here to close one chapter of your life and begin a new one. A chapter filled with love, security, and family." Mrs. Walker dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, and Mr. Walker placed a steadying hand on her arm. The judge continued, "Mia, do you have anything you'd like to say?" Mia glanced at Marcus, who gave her an encouraging nod. She stood slowly, her legs shaking as she faced the judge. I just want to say thank you," she began, her voice wavering but strong. "To the Walkers for giving me a home, to Marcus for never giving up on me, and to you for making this happen." Her gaze swept over the room, landing on each person who had supported her. "I spent a long time thinking I wasn't good enough," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But now I know that I am, and it's because of them." The room was silent for a moment, and then Judge Harrison smiled. "Thank you, Mia. Your words are a testament to the strength of this family." With that, he signed the final documents, and the room erupted into quiet applause. Marcus grabbed Mia's hand, pulling her into a hug. "You're stuck with us now," he teased, his grin widening. Mia laughed through her tears. "Good. I don't want to be anywhere else." That evening, the Walkers hosted a small gathering at their home. Mia's new bedroom, freshly painted in her favorite shade of lavender, was revealed as a surprise, complete with a new desk and a set of bookshelves. Marcus had even added a small note on her pillow that read, "Welcome to forever." As the party wound down, Mia stood in the backyard, watching the stars twinkle above. Marcus joined her, a slice of cake in hand. "You did it," he said, handing her the plate. "We did it," Mia corrected, taking a bite of the cake. They stood in companionable silence for a while, the night air cool against their skin. "You know," Mia said eventually, "I think Mom would be happy." Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars. "She would. She'd be really proud of you." Mia smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. For the first time in years, she felt whole. She wasn't just Mia, the foster kid, or Mia, the girl who had been forgotten. She was Mia Walker, a sister, a daughter, and most importantly, part of a family. And as she stood there, surrounded by the warmth of her new life, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The journey ahead. The stars above sparkled like distant promises, their light casting faint shadows on the backyard grass. Marcus leaned against the porch railing, stealing glances at Mia as she picked at her cake, her face a mixture of reflection and contentment. "You ever think about what's next?" Marcus asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. Mia turned to him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, like, now that everything's settled, what do you want to do? You've got a whole future ahead of you." Mia looked down at her plate, her fork scraping against the frosting. The question caught her off guard, not because she didn't have dreams, but because she had spent so long simply trying to survive that imagining a future felt foreign. "I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't thought about it much. I guess I just want to feel normal." Marcus tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "You mean, like going to school, hanging out with friends, stuff like that?" Mia nodded. "Yeah. Things kids are supposed to do. I've always felt like I was watching everyone else live their lives, but now, maybe I can live mine too." Marcus grinned. "You're already doing it. Trust me, you're way cooler than I ever was." Mia laughed, the sound light and genuine. That's not saying much, Marcus. He feigned offense, clutching his chest dramatically. Wow. Rude. The two of them burst into laughter, the kind that came from a place of ease and familiarity. For the first time, Mia felt like she could let her guard down, not just with Marcus, but with the world. Inside the house, Mrs. Walker stood by the kitchen window, watching the two siblings on the porch. Her heart swelled as she saw Mia laugh, a sound that had been so rare when she first arrived. Mr. Walker joined her, a cup of tea in his hand. "They look happy," he said, his voice quiet. "They are," Mrs. Walker replied, her eyes misty. "It's taken so much to get here, but I think they're finally starting to believe this is real." Mr. Walker placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's more than real. It's permanent. We're a family now, and nothing's going to change that." Mrs. Walker nodded, her resolve firm. "We just have to keep showing her, every day, in every little way. We need to make sure she knows she's safe, that she's loved." The next morning, Mia woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. The sunlight streamed in, painting her lavender walls in soft, golden hues. For a moment, she lay there, staring at the ceiling and marveling at the calmness in her chest. There were no nightmares, no dread about what the day would bring, only the quiet promise of another day in her new life. She climbed out of bed and padded to the bookshelf Marcus had helped her fill with books and small trinkets. Her fingers brushed over the red leather photo album, and she smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude for the memories it held. Downstairs, the smell of pancakes greeted her. Marcus was already at the table, shoveling food into his mouth with his usual lack of decorum. Mrs. Walker stood at the stove, flipping another batch, while Mr. Walker sat with the morning paper, his coffee steaming nearby. "Morning, sleepyhead," Marcus said through a mouthful of syrup. "Good morning, sweetheart," Mrs. Walker added, turning to smile at her. "Morning," Mia replied, sliding into her seat. She looked around the table, the scene so warm and ordinary that it made her heart ache in the best way. "So Mr. Walker began, folding his paper. I've been thinking, it might be time for a family outing." Marcus's eyes lit up. "Like what? Bowling? Laser tag?" Mia raised an eyebrow. "You're terrible at laser tag." "Excuse me, I'm a strategic genius," Marcus shot back, grinning. Mr. Walker chuckled. "Actually, I was thinking about something a little more low-key. Maybe a picnic at the park or a trip to the aquarium. Something we can all enjoy." Mia's face brightened at the mention of the aquarium. "I've never been to one," she said, her tone filled with wonder. "Then it's settled," Mrs. Walker said, setting a plate of pancakes in front of Mia. "We'll go this weekend. It'll be fun." The week passed quickly, and by the time Saturday arrived, Mia was buzzing with excitement. The Walkers packed a picnic basket with sandwiches, snacks, and a thermos of lemonade, and they set off for the city's aquarium. When they arrived, Mia's eyes widened at the sight of the enormous building, its glass facade reflecting the sunlight. Inside, she was mesmerized by the shimmering tanks filled with colorful fish, graceful jellyfish, and majestic sharks. Marcus, of course, made it his mission to press his face against every tank, much to the amusement of the other visitors. "Look at this one," Marcus exclaimed, pointing at a giant octopus. "It looks like it's plotting world domination." Mia laughed, shaking her head. "You're such a dork." But her teasing didn't stop her from being just as enthralled. She stood in front of a tank filled with sea turtles, her reflection blending with the creatures as they glided effortlessly through the water. For a moment, she felt like she was part of their world, free, unburdened, and full of possibility. Mrs. Walker stepped beside her, a soft smile on her face. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Mia nodded. "Yeah, they're amazing." Mrs. Walker placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're amazing too, Mia. Don't ever forget that." Mia looked up at her, the words sinking deep into her heart. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." Mrs. Walker pulled her into a hug. "You don't have to thank me, sweetheart. We're family. That's what we do." That night, as the Walkers drove home under a sky full of stars, Maya leaned her head against the window, a content smile on her face. For the first time in her life, she didn't just feel like she had a place to stay. She felt like she belonged. The future was still uncertain, but for Mia, that no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a promise that she didn't have to face it alone. As they pulled into the driveway, Marcus nudged her shoulder. "Hey, Mia." "Yeah. You're stuck with us now, you know." Mia grinned, her heart swelling with love for her brother and her new family. "Good," she said, "because I'm not going anywhere." The beginning of forever. It was a crisp autumn morning when Mia and Marcus stood at the edge of the park, watching the golden leaves drift to the ground like whispers from the trees. The air was cool and filled with the earthy scent of fallen foliage. In the distance, families played catch, joggers passed by, and a group of children laughed as they flew kites. Mia tugged her jacket closer around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on a small pond shimmering in the sunlight. Marcus, always the ball of energy, kicked a soccer ball back and forth near her, but his attention kept flicking toward his sister. "You're quiet today," Marcus said, nudging the ball her way. Mia caught it with her foot, her movements hesitant but steady. "Just thinking," she replied. "About?" She hesitated, then gave the ball a gentle kick back to him. "About everything. How much things have changed. How much I've changed." Marcus stopped the ball under his foot and tilted his head, his expression curious. "Good changes, right?" Mia smiled faintly, her eyes thoughtful. "Yeah, really good changes, but sometimes it feels like it's too good to be true, like I'm waiting for it all to go away." Marcus stepped closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It's not going anywhere, Mia. Not me. Not the Walkers. Not any of this. You're stuck with us." She let out a soft laugh, the sound warming the chilly air. "You always say that." "Because it's true," he said firmly. "You're not alone anymore." Mia's smile widened, and for the first time, she felt the truth of his words settle deep into her heart. That evening, back at the Walker house, the family gathered around the fireplace in the living room. The crackling flames cast a warm glow over the room, illuminating the walls adorned with new family photos. Among them was a picture from the day of Mia's adoption. She and Marcus standing between the Walkers, their smiles bright and their arms linked. Mrs. Walker handed out mugs of hot chocolate, each one topped with a generous swirl of whipped cream and a sprinkle of cinnamon. "All right," she said, settling into her chair. "Family meeting time." Mia and Marcus exchanged amused glances. Family meetings had become a tradition in the Walker household, though they were rarely serious. Instead, they were a time to reflect, share news, and occasionally plan adventures. Mr. Walker cleared his throat, his expression unusually formal. "As you both know, the holidays are coming up. And this year, we wanted to do something special, something meaningful." Mia's brows furrowed in curiosity. "Like what?" Mrs. Walker smiled warmly. "We were thinking about taking a trip, just the four of us, somewhere that feels like a fresh start." Marcus perked up. "A trip? Where are we going?" "Disneyland." "A cruise?" "Wait, don't tell me. It's a hot air balloon ride." Mia laughed, shaking her head. "Marcus, calm down. Let them finish." Mr. Walker chuckled. "It's nothing quite that extravagant. We were thinking of a cabin in the mountains, a place where we can unplug, spend time together, and celebrate how far we've all come." Mia's eyes lit up. "That sounds amazing." "It's not just about the trip," Mrs. Walker added. "It's about creating new memories, our memories, ones that belong to all of us." Marcus raised his mug in a toast. "To new memories." Mia hesitated for a moment, then lifted her own mug, her heart swelling with gratitude. "To new memories," she echoed. The following weekend, the family packed up their car and headed to the mountains. The drive was long but filled with laughter and music. Marcus, ever the entertainer, belted out every song on the playlist, much to Mia's amusement and mild embarrassment. Mrs. Walker snapped candid photos along the way, capturing moments of joy that felt almost surreal. When they arrived at the cabin, the sight took Maya's breath away. Nestled in a grove of pine trees, the rustic wooden structure exuded warmth and charm. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a blanket of snow covered the surrounding landscape, glittering in the sunlight. "This is perfect," Mia whispered as they stepped inside. The cabin was cozy and inviting, with a stone fireplace, soft rugs, and large windows that offered a stunning view of the mountains. "That's the idea," Mr. Walker said, setting down their bags. "Now who's ready for some exploring?" The next few days were filled with adventures. The family hiked through snowy trails, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. Marcus attempted to build a snowman, which quickly devolved into a snowball fight that left everyone breathless and rosy-cheeked. In the evenings, they gathered around the fireplace, playing board games and sharing stories. One night, as the fire crackled and the world outside seemed to disappear, Maya found herself opening up in a way she never had before. She told the Walkers about her favorite memories of her mother, the way she used to sing while cooking, the stories she would make up at bedtime, the way she always said, "You're stronger than you know." Mrs. Walker listened intently, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Your mother sounds like an incredible woman," she said softly. "She'd be so proud of you, Mia." Mia looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm strong enough to deserve all this, to keep it." Mr. Walker leaned forward, his expression gentle but firm. "Mia, you've been through more than most people ever will, and you've come out of it with a heart full of love and courage. That's strength, and you don't have to keep this family. It's already yours, forever." Mia's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude. She looked at Marcus, who gave her a reassuring smile, and at the Walkers, who had become the family she never thought she'd have. In that moment, she felt a sense of belonging so profound it left her breathless. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling but strong, "for everything." On their last day of the cabin, Maya stood on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in hues of gold and pink. Marcus joined her, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said. Mia nodded, her breath visible in the cold morning air. "Yeah, it really is." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey unspoken but understood. "You know," Marcus said, breaking the quiet, "Mom used to say that every sunrise was a chance to start over. A new day, a new beginning." Mia smiled, her heart swelling with hope. "I like that." Marcus nudged her shoulder. "And you know what? I think we're going to be okay." Mia turned to him, her smile widening. "I think so too." As the sun climbed higher, bathing the world in light, Maya felt a sense of peace she had never known before. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe in the promise of forever. A new chapter begins. The sun climbed higher over the mountain peaks, illuminating the snow-covered world with a golden glow. Maya stood on the porch, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if it held the secrets to her new life. Marcus shifted beside her, his usual energy subdued in the quiet majesty of the morning. "What's next, do you think?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For us," Marcus shrugged. "Whatever we want. That's the whole point, isn't it? A fresh start. We get to decide." Mia nodded slowly, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Yeah, I like that." The sound of footsteps on the wooden floor behind them made them both turn. Mrs. Walker appeared, bundled in a thick sweater and holding 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. "Thought you two might like these," she said, handing them over. "Thanks, Mom," Marcus said, taking his mug with a grin. Mia paused, her fingers curling around the warm mug. The word lingered in her mind. Mom. It wasn't the first time Marcus had used it, but hearing it now, standing in this place of newfound peace, it felt different. Real. She glanced at Mrs. Walker, whose kind smile and soft eyes were so full of warmth, it made Maya's chest tighten. You don't have to call me that if you're not ready, Mrs. Walker said gently, as though reading Mia's thoughts. Mia hesitated, her throat tight with emotion. No, she said, her voice barely audible. I think I'd like to. Mrs. Walker's smile deepened, and she reached out to brush a strand of hair from Mia's face. Whenever you're ready, sweetheart, we'll be here. The drive back from the mountains was filled with a comfortable quiet. The snow-covered landscape gradually gave way to familiar streets, and when they finally pulled into the driveway of their home, Maya felt a pang of relief. The cabin had been magical, but this house, this warm, inviting house, was her home. Mrs. Walker unlocked the door, and the family stepped inside, the familiar scents and sights wrapping around them like a comforting blanket. Maya lingered in the entryway, her gaze sweeping over the living room, the photos on the walls, and the cozy furniture. It felt surreal to think that just a few months ago, she had been in a place where hope felt like a distant dream. Marcus dropped his bags and flopped onto the couch with a groan. Home sweet home, he declared. Mia smiled and set her own bag down. It really is, she said softly. The following weeks passed in a blur of routine and small victories. Maya returned to school, her initial nerves gradually giving way to cautious confidence. She joined a small group of classmates for a science project, surprising herself with how easy it was to talk to them. For the first time in years, she felt like a normal kid, not just a foster child, not just someone waiting for the next move. At home, the Walkers continued to build a sense of stability and love around her. Mrs. Walker introduced her to baking, and together they spent an afternoon covered in flour, laughing over their attempts to make cookies that didn't look like squashed pancakes. Mr. Walker took her and Marcus to the park on weekends, teaching them how to fly kites and sharing stories from his childhood. Nita's favorite moments, though, were the quiet ones, sitting by the fireplace with a book, helping Marcus with his schoolwork, or simply listening to the sound of her new family moving through the house. Those moments reminded her of how far she had come, and how much she had gained. One evening, as Mia sat on her bed sketching in a notebook, there was a knock at her door. "Come in," she called. Mrs. Walker stepped inside, holding a small box wrapped in silver paper. "I have something for you," she said, sitting beside Mia on the bed. Maya tilted her head, curious. "What is it?" "Open it and see." Mia carefully untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside was a delicate locket, its gold surface etched with an intricate design. She opened it to find two small photos, one of her and Marcus as toddlers, and one of her new family, taken at the courthouse on the day of her adoption. "It's beautiful," Mia whispered, her fingers brushing over the locket. Mrs. Walker placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's a reminder," she said softly, "of where you've been and where you are now. And no matter what happens, you'll always have both." Mia felt tears well up in her eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude. She looked up at Mrs. Walker and said the words that had been resting on her heart since that morning on the porch. "Thank you, Mom." Mrs. Walker's breath hitched, and she pulled Mia into a tight hug. "You're so loved, Mia. Never forget that." As Mia held onto her, the locket pressed against her chest. She felt the weight of the past lift a little more. She wasn't just a girl searching for a place to belong. She was part of a family that had chosen her, fought for her, and loved her unconditionally. That night, as she lay in bed, Mia stared at the locket in her hand. The photos inside felt like a bridge between the life she had left behind and the one she was building now. She thought of her mother's words, "You're stronger than you know." Mia smiled to herself. She had been strong enough to survive, to hope, and to open her heart again. And now, with her family beside her, She was ready for whatever came next. As she drifted off to sleep, a sense of peace washed over her. She didn't need to fear the future anymore. She was Mia Walker, and she was home.